With the NHL trade deadline over and done with, we now focus our efforts onto the NHL draft this year and projected first overall pick in Matthew Schaefer, who's going to be a transformative defenseman in this draft. With the confidence, the skating ability he has, as a pure offensive D, he is going to be so much fun to watch. And especially this year, there are a lot of teams in the lottery race that could use a #1 defenseman of the future. So which teams do I see needing Matthew Schaefer the most? Which teams make the most sense? And who is most likely to end up grabbing him on draft day? Well, make sure you watch till the end as we go through all of the different team scenarios, and make sure you hit that subscribe button for more hockey prospect content just like this as we lead up to the draft this summer, presented by BetUS. Now, how today's going to work is that we're going to go through the lottery teams in this year's draft, at least as of right now, and see which fits make the most sense for Schaefer, going through a top 10 and going from number 10 to the team that I think deserves him and needs him, quite frankly, the most. But first, we have to talk about just how special Matthew Schaefer is, because that is an important part here. He is a projected first overall pick for a reason, and even though I personally prefer Michael Misa in this race, Schaefer is somebody that could absolutely see the reasons why you'd have him at #1. Unfortunately for us, Schaefer suffered a pretty fluke injury at the World Juniors that has kept him out of play until really now. He might end up playing at the end of the regular season, but most likely he'll return to the U18 World Juniors, a tournament he was great at last year and is likely to dominate at this season. You can see in 17 OHL games, 7 goals, 15 assists, 22 points, especially in that last month before he got injured. He was absolutely dominant, looking brilliant for Erie and a cornerstone piece there in the OHL. Was likely to have a dominant OHL season until, of course, that brutal injury. Really, the name of the game in Schaefer's case is that confidence and how he's able to use it all throughout the ice. The way he's able to rush up, just looking like a forward out there in the best ways, dominating against OHL competition. The confidence there is so smooth. The skating is so elite for his age. And he's somebody that, in terms of the pure puck ability, the pure offensive potential, is sky high. And defensively, I don't think he's a slouch either, especially against the rush. He uses his skating so well to be able to create pressure and make sure that that rush offense isn't able to get started. He's somebody especially there that I think has a lot of potential. When the defensive game gets going, I think he can get a little bit lost in the play, trying to play hero mode, getting up the ice, but a lot of the time it does end up working because of just how confident and stylish he can be. The creativity is through the roof, the skating is through the roof, the offensive potential is all there, and I think that's why teams are so excited about this kid. All those different attributes, I think, are a big reason why most likely he'll end up going first overall in this draft class. We'll get into a couple of exceptions, teams that I don't think need a defenseman whatsoever that might end up going in a different direction. But in most cases, the team that's going #1 is picking Matthew Schaefer. The first team that I just don't see as a fit whatsoever for Schaefer is the Buffalo Sabres, who have lefty like Dahlin, Power, and Byram. And even if they were to trade one of those guys like Bowen Byram, for example, they'd still have Dahlin and Owen Power. And I feel like in Schaefer's case, it might be just a detriment to his career, because playing behind a player like Dahlin, I think would just kind of give him less opportunity automatically. But I do think in the Sabres case, if they already have Dahlin on the right side for the future, then maybe you could have a Schaefer-Dahlin pair. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world for his career, but I think there's a lot of other teams that can just give him more of an opportunity and, quite frankly, need him more too. Another team I don't really see as a big fit is the Anaheim Ducks. If this was maybe 5 years ago, then I think the Ducks would be all over a player like a Schaefer, obviously. But you look at that left side right now, you got Jackson Lacombe, who's transformed as a top pair defenseman for this Ducks team, who is looking brilliant there. You got Olin Zellweger as a premier offensive play driver. You got Pavel Mintyukov as well, who also brings a lot to the game as well. And I feel like that left side is pretty clogged already. Sure, you could potentially move one of them to the right, but I consider the Ducks' left side to be practically perfect. I don't think they need to make any more additions. That forward group is definitely going to be the focus if they were to go first overall. And let's be honest, if the Ducks have the chance for Porter Martone at all, I feel like that's their guy no matter what. Starting us out on the list today, for the teams that I think need Matthew Schaefer the most, let's start out at number 10 here with the Detroit Red Wings. No, I think this season the Red Wings definitely could have used a player like Matthew Schaefer. Long term, I think they could survive without him, and that's mostly because of Axel Sandin Pellikka, who one of the best prospects in the NHL today, one of the best offensive defenseman prospects in the NHL today, if not the best, right up there with a player like Z. Buell. I think he's going to be an excellent top 4 puck-moving power play defenseman, and somebody that if they don't get Schaefer, I think they'll be just fine with. I think the big reason, though, that Detroit finds themselves in this top 10 is that I think they could really use both a Sandin Pellikka and a Matthew Schaefer. When I look at the left side on defense, I think they could still use at least a second pair guy. I'm a big fan of Simone Edvinsson, and I think he'll be fantastic there. But I could see a situation where the Red Wings would really like a top four of Schaefer, Seider, and then Edvinsson, Axel, Sandy, and Pellikka. That would be absolutely devastating. Really, the only prospect on the left side coming up that I think will make a major impact is Shai Buam, who is somebody that's having a solid season in the AHL this year, but I think projects most likely as just a dependable bottom pair defenseman. Not anything too crazy there on the offensive side, which of course Schaefer brings entirely. So even though Detroit isn't near the very top, I mean, Matthew Schaefer would practically complete that defense for me entirely. It would give them just that extra bit of offensive edge that really gives the pressure off a player like Axel Sandin to always be the offensive guy. But I think Detroit could easily find a middle pair offensive defenseman to kind of fill that hole for the future. So we'll have to wait and see what happens there. Now, at number 9, I wanted to go on to the Utah Hockey Club, a team that I thought would be very interesting with a player like Schaefer. Now, they don't have any chance at first overall right now in terms of if this were to stay in the standings, but they could maybe switch places with a team like the New York Islanders, and I could see maybe Utah rising up somehow. But if they were to end up landing a player like Schaefer, I think that would be pretty beneficial, especially when you look at what the defense is now and what they have coming up. A lot of the defensemen that both Utah and Arizona have drafted as of late, at least in high-end positions, are more the big, physical, skating, defensive kind, with players like Dmitry Simashev, Maverick Lamoureux, even a player like Will Skahan in the second round last year. These are big boys that fill defensive needs. And I look at Utah, and I don't think they have that premier puck mover to really insulate them perfectly. Again, a player like Sergachev is solid, Dursey is solid, but they're not going to be on the level that I think Matthew Schaefer can be. The reason, though, that Utah still comes a little bit lower, though, is just the fact that likely you're going to have a top 2 lefty side of Sergachev and Simashev, which I think is still going to be pretty great to see, honestly, especially when Simashev does hit his peak as this physical defensive stalwart. I think they'll be just fine in that position, but with a player like Schaefer especially, I'm imagining a Schaefer, Sergachev, Simashev left side, which would probably be the best in the NHL. Now, before we move on to number 8 and the rest of the list, let's first talk about today's sponsor in BetUS. If you're looking to make hockey picks throughout this year, especially as we go to the playoffs this season, BetUS is the place to do so. And you can make picks all throughout every single NHL game with the over-unders, as well as going through the Stanley Cup winners. Right now, we got the updated odds after the trade deadline, and both the Panthers and the Stars are tied at plus 600, which I think does make sense there. They seem to be the two favorites. If you want to make your picks on the Stanley Cup and all the playoff games this year, BetUS is the place to do so. Just use code YouTube150 when you sign up, and you'll get a 150% sign-up bonus on your first deposit and 125% sign-up bonus on your next 2 deposits after that. Now let's get right back to the action here. And at number 8, I'm going to go with the Seattle Kraken in this position. Now, I think most likely they'll end up being okay, especially considering their position. I think they're more likely to go after a forward in this slot. But I think considering what Seattle could really use, I think especially that pop in offensive play, I think they really could use a true superstar on that left side. Now, you do have Vince Dunn, who's been a solid, consistent performer for them, and Riker Evans, who looks to be one of the more underrated young D in the league. But I think Schaefer still clears both of them in terms of the potential, especially when it comes to offense. And I look at what Seattle could really use, somebody that could drive play up the rush, especially, and I think Schaefer fills that box perfectly for that. But like the last 2 teams, the big reason why they aren't higher is that I think they can survive without a player like Schaefer, even though I think he'd be transformative for an offense that I think could really use some more from the back end. They have a player like Caden Price as well as a lefty on top of Riker Evans and Vince Dunn. And then you got on the right side players like Lukas Dravisevich and Ty Nelson that could really bring the offense when needed. So we'll see what ends up happening there. But I think for Seattle, that extra little bit of juice would be fun. But I think, again, most likely they'll probably end up going for especially a winger in this draft, though I would like to see them go after the right defenseman because that, I think, could really complete their defense as well. Again, I've talked about it in the last couple of mock drafts, I think, but a Radim Murko would be really fun there, and I think that's most likely who they end up with. Now, at number 7, we're starting to get to the teams that I think would be really changed by a presence like Matthew Schaefer, a transformative offensive D like him. And at number 7, a team that might surprise some people, I have the Chicago Blackhawks this high. Now, I feel like most people would likely have Chicago a little bit lower just because of how many defensemen they have drafted consistently over the years. And I'll be the first one to admit that in terms of lefty options, I think Chicago would do just fine. And especially if you're higher on some of these guys than I am, you got a player like Alex Vlasic, who got that long-term extension already, has had a little bit of a tough sophomore season, but still has been growing in some key areas, especially offensively. You got a player like Kevin Korchinski, Nolan Allen, Ethan Del Mastro. In terms of the names, I think Chicago will be just fine. But I think the big thing that keeps Schaefer a little bit higher for me with Chicago is how I view Kevin Korchinski. And this really will depend to your spot with Chicago, because if you're low on Kevin Korchinski, I think Chicago could be even higher. Personally, I'm middling with him, and he's somebody that was drafted, of course, 7th overall by Chicago, was a high pick for them. I had more so in the 15 to 20 range back in his draft year in 2022, and I think he's had a lot of struggles adapting to the NHL level, being able to combine that speed and pace and make it work all together and be able to combat the physicality that comes with it. He's been okay at points in the AHL, but I think as a project has been a little bit disappointing so far. And if he's somebody that you don't really see working out, then I think Schaefer almost becomes a need for them. Because if Korchinski doesn't work out, you have a bit of an offensive hole, I would say, on that left side coming up. I think on the rights, you'd be pretty fine with players like Brinzel and Levshunov. I think those two guys are going to be solid top 4 defensemen. But on the left side, I think you could be missing a little bit of an offensive element there, which, of course, Schaefer would bring perfectly. But to me, the main reason why Chicago is a little bit lower here is just because of how much more they need a forward. Sure, I think they could really use a player like Schaefer if you're lower on a player like Korchinski, like I am, but don't kid ourselves here. They could so much more use a player like a Michael Misa and the smarts he brings, a Porter Martone and the feistiness he provides, even a player like Higgins and the skills that he's able to bring in the center position. There's just so much more potential there for Chicago's forward group with those 3 players. And I think in terms of the team need, a forward is so clearly above a defenseman that it leaves Chicago still in the second half of this list. Still, though, Schaefer would be pretty awesome on Chicago and would make that defensive future even more scary. Now, at number 6, you might not realize this team was in the lottery position they are at, but I have the New York Islanders, who currently have the last spot that has odds at first overall at that 11th position in the Tankathon standings. But I think in terms of team needs and what the Islanders could really use going forward, especially if they are going to be shopping a player like Noah Dobson, a player like Schaefer becomes really almost a need for them. Especially when you look at what the Islanders have drafted year over year and what they could really use in that prospect pool. You have really big time forwards like Cole Yzerman, Danny Nelson, Quinn Finley from the 2022 draft, but a lot of their defensemen have been more on the defensive side. Players like Kalioti Elias, Isaiah George has been looking pretty good. Really the only exception there has been Jesse Polkin in the last year's draft, but he is a big bunch of magic beans. A player like Matthew Schaefer, though, would be transformative for that defense, especially for a team like the Islanders, who is just starved for offensive generation. That is Schaefer's game, is offensive generation from the back end. And I think they could really use somebody like that who also doesn't really sacrifice too much defense. I feel like that's something that has been a frustrating point for a player like Noah Dobson for the Islanders management, has been the inconsistencies in his defensive end. Schaefer really doesn't bring those major mistakes, and I think that's something the Islanders could also really appreciate. Now getting into the top 5, and this is where it really gets close, because I think 5 to 1, all of these teams need Schaefer at a pretty similar level, but I wanted to go on the San Jose Sharks here, who would be easily, by far, number 1 if it wasn't for last year's draft. In 2024, they were able to select 11th overall Sam Dickinson, who I think will be a great top 4 defenseman for them, and somebody that I do think can fill in to a top pair role if he needs to. He can be taken in so many different directions, but just in general this year, I think he's vastly improved himself with London, going from 70 points last year to on pace 91 this season. I think also just getting better defensively has been a big point of contention for him. We'll see what happens and how he's able to develop that offensive skill set, but I think he could be quite solid. You also got Luca Cagnoni as a pure offensive D, who has been progressing exceptionally well in San Jose's system. I didn't really see him being this good of a pro already. I saw some growing pains there, but offensively, he is unbelievable. Already 42 points in 54 games with the Barracuda this year. It is looking awesome there as a power play option in the future. And you also got on the left side, Leo Solly and Elanius, who I'm not the biggest fan of personally, but I think could be an okay puck mover on a third pair potentially, and could fill that type of role as a former second rounder. So you look at the left D that San Jose has coming up, and they're honestly pretty set. And then I look at that 4 group, and especially with a player like Will Smith likely fitting in on the wings in the future, you have a player like Celebrini, who of course is locked in as that first line centerman, not really anything touching that. But I think the Sharks could really use that definitive play-driving second line center. And especially in the case of a player like James Higgins or Michael Misa, I think they could fill that pretty effortlessly. So I look at what the Sharks actually do need in this draft, what they could use in the future, and I think a second line center is a lot more of a need for them than another left defenseman. Obviously, Matthew Schaefer is transformative, and having a Schaefer, Dickinson, Cagnoni left side would be unbelievable. But I think the second line center is a much higher priority for the Sharks, especially to get that forward group well-rounded with wings like Quentin Musty and Igor Chernyshov as well coming up. I still have the Sharks in the top 5 because I think they could still really use a player like Schaefer that is up to his level, but I think considering how well Castiglione especially has been developing as an offensive D, I think he'll be just fine in the power play as a PP1 type of D and being able to make that work as a second pair defenseman. Now, getting us inside the top 4, this is now the range where I see definitively these teams desperately needing a player like Matthew Schaefer. And let's start out with the Nashville Predators, who I think are in a weird spot at this year's draft with how much they've had this roster turnover, with how disappointing this season has been. They could really use another transformative piece. Really, it could be anybody, whether that's a Misa, whether that's a Schaefer. I don't think the Preds can go wrong. They really need everything in the future. I think especially for the Preds, having that elite puck mover that can learn from a player like Roman Josi in those later years, I think would be awesome for them. I mean, going from a player like Josi to Schaefer would be unfair in terms of the puck moving. I think the two players are very comparable as well, and Josi's still killing it at 34 years old. I do look at the left side options, and Tanner Molendyk I think is a solid one, though definitely not near the type of play that Schaefer provides. I mean, the fact that Schaefer was almost immediately able to eclipse him as Canada's #1 power play option, I think does show that pretty perfectly. He's somebody that I think will be a decent power play 2 option, but not somebody that I think is going to lead a team offensively like a player like Josi could. So even though Nashville has somebody there that could pick up the load for a little bit, I think in Schaefer's case, he's somebody that really projects as that true first pair definitive defenseman that could really succeed Josi in a lot of clear and key attributes. But you could also make the case that Nashville maybe needs a first line center in the future a lot more. I mean, looking at the situation here, players like Ryan O'Reilly and Colton Sissons as their top 2 centers, it's not looking great. I like a player like Fyodor Svechkov, but I don't think he's going to be able to reach those type of levels. A player like Michael Misa or James Higgins would also be transformative for that Nashville team. Really, I think what we're learning is that Nashville needs a lot in the future and maybe needs both Misa and Schaefer, honestly. Now, at number 3, we're going to go to a team that you might not expect to see on the list, but absolutely should be here, and that is the Boston Bruins. Now, we saw them, of course, selling a lot of the deadline, selling their captain, Brad Marchand. It is a rough state for that Bruins franchise. But they've been so bad as of late, they have the 9th best odds in Tankathon right now. They have a 5% chance at winning first overall. That's not nothing at all. And I think for the Bruins, they could really use a cornerstone franchise defensive piece. On top of course, Charlie McAvoy on that right side. You look at the left side coming up, and really besides Mason Lowry, it's pretty barren. You have a player like Elliot Grunewald, who they drafted in the 4th round last year, who's been a decent player for Quinnipiac, but nothing all that special. If he were to make it, he's probably just a third pairing guy. But in the case of the Bruins, Lowry is solid. I think he has some great potential there, but let's not kid ourselves. Schaefer is somebody the Bruins could especially need, and especially with this new group of Bruins coming up that they're going to want to build, this draft is going to be transformative in a lot of ways, and a player like Schaefer would really pave the way for a lot more success than they would have otherwise had. The Bruins are another team that I do think just kind of needs everything like the Nashville Predators. Their prospect pool is completely barren. But I do think in the Bruins case, they could really use that left D that just changes things up, brings them another offensive element there, and also just makes things easier for Charlie McAvoy. It gives him a position where it can be more of the defensive defenseman that I think he ought to be, honestly, and allow Schaefer to truly transform that team. Plus, you still have some options there like David Pastrnak, and in terms of what Schaefer could really use as a power play option, him and Pastrnak I think would be awesome together. Now, at number 2, this is another team that you might be a little bit surprised to see this high, but I have the Philadelphia Flyers. I especially look at their prospect pool, the guys they've already had coming up, and the youth core they have there. It's quite solid, but I think a lot of the potential comes in the forward group of players like Matvei Michkov, and maybe on the right side of the defense if you're a bit high on a player like Oliver Bonk, for example. But I look at that left side, and even though Cam York has his moments, I think he, as a pure offensive D, Schaefer could clear him as soon as next year, honestly. And you look at a lot of the defensemen Philly has drafted over the last couple of years, and they've mostly been right defensemen. Oliver Bonk in the 1st round, a player like Spencer Gill in the 2nd, Carter Southern in the 5th. These are all guys that project as, I would say, middle pair defenseman most likely, especially in a player like Bonk's case. I think he'll be okay, but I don't think he's going to be the transformative defenseman that Philly needs. A player like Matthew Schaefer, though, I think is just going to change that Philly offense completely, especially with the players like Jet Luchenko as well coming up. They're going to have a lot of smart players. Schaefer, though, just brings so much skill, so much pace, and that's something that I think Philly is going to really adore and really crave as well. Tortorella might have some problems here and there with how much he joins the rush, but with how well Schaefer can get back into the play, I don't think it's gonna be much of a problem. But now we move on to number 1, and in my opinion, the team that needs Matthew Schaefer the most, and this might be a disagreement for some, especially considering how much luck this team has gotten in the past with the draft lottery, but I'm not really counting that in this video. I'm just looking at what the team needs for the future, what they could desperately use in that prospect pool, and to me, the team that needs him the most is the Pittsburgh Penguins. I think we all need to prepare ourselves for the eventual likelihood that Pittsburgh jumps in this draft. They are 6th worst in the league this year, and they have about a 7.5% chance of jumping up to 1st overall. So that's not nothing. And I think for the Penguins, especially when I look at what they could use in the future, especially in terms of their positioning in the prospect pool, Schaefer would be such a game changer. It's hard to explain. And the prospect pool also comes into play. Really, the only lefty that I see having any NHL potential in this system really at all is Owen Pickering, who I think will most likely solidify himself as more of a defensive, physical presence for this Penguins team. And that's not bad whatsoever, but I think fits more of 3rd pair, 2nd pair minutes realistically. A player like Schaefer, though, of course, with the influence of a player like Chris Letang as well, and being able to learn from him, just like he could with Roman Josi in Nashville, I think would, one, be very beneficial for Schaefer, but I also look at that Pittsburgh system and that what they could desperately use, and I think they could use a player like a prime Chris Letang, who is actually able to rush up the ice effortlessly, make it look so easy, but also be able to, at some points even better than Letang, make up for his defensive mistakes with the skating ability and really transform that team's offense. If you're looking at a player like Crosby and Malkin, if you're Dubas and you've promised them a competitive team in the future, landing a player like Matthew Schaefer with the skill set he has would expedite that rebuild so quickly. Now, of course, the Penguins, I don't think would say no to a player like a Misa or a Martone or a Higgins whatsoever, but I feel like a Schaefer in terms of what the Penguins need, that offensive juice that they aren't going to be having here soon once Chris Letang likely jumps the ship. I just feel like there is so much for Schaefer that would go so right in Pittsburgh and will be the exact type of franchise face they haven't been able to draft in a long time, and would really rejuvenate that prospect pool in a major way. But that's my complete top 10 for the teams that I believe need Matthew Schaefer the most. I hope you guys did enjoy. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit the notification bell. Comment down below your thoughts on the Schaefer race, who you ultimately see winning Schaefer, and who do you think needs Schaefer the most in this draft lottery situation. I'd love to know your thoughts down below. Of course, make sure you share the video with all the hockey fans you guys know online. Click on this card for all my draft content, and sign up to BetUS today using code YouTube150. I hope you have a fantastic hockey day, y'all, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.